Sometimes the form of acculturation that somebody takes is voluntarily chosen, and sometimes the form that is taken is forced upon the new immigrant. Berry had four preconditions that would determine the likelihood of which strategy might be pursued. The first is the level of acceptance by a society for the value of cultural diversity. If the society I am integrating into does not value cultural diversity, it will be harder for me to integrate into it. There also may be a level of prejudice. There may be attitudes among ethnocultural groups, my own ethnocultural group, other ethnocultural groups that are part of that society that may affect the form of acculturation. And the extent of my identification with the larger society by individuals and by groups. So, what kind of identification do I have with the dominant culture? All of those things are going to affect the way that I acculturate. Some acculturations are not voluntary at all. So we're going to look at just a couple of historical examples. The US and Canada both began problems of forced assimilation of Native American children in the 1870s. The Native American children at a very young age were removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools where they would not have the influence of their traditional tribal cultures to help them grow up. The programs were unsuccessful, extremely unsuccessful. Um, and the children became alienated both from their native culture and from the new culture. So these children were marginalized. They had no way to choose their cultural norm. How do you think this affected the children and their families and their tribes? Obviously, many of these children grew up with trauma or with psychological issues, and these problems continued for decades. So, if we want to think about how it happened with the boarding school experience, so the Native Americans lost their connections to their culture, their traditions, and languages. So, if you look at the picture on the left, this is a picture from the Carlisle Indian School, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. This was the best known of the residential Indian schools, but there were quite a few of these schools. The top picture and the bottom picture are the same group of students. The top picture is when these students arrived at the Carlisle School, and the bottom is when the children had been there at about 4 months. 4 months later, so you notice that one of the first things that happened was that the children were required to give up their native dress and instead were put in uniforms. Their hair was cut, which was a huge insult for the Native American children. They often lost their names, which had had particular cultural value to them, and they instead were given names that resonated with the dominant English speaking culture. They suffered trauma not only from being separated from their families and their culture, but also because the conditions at the schools themselves were not nurturing for children. As you can see from the uniforms, they were run on the style of the military. Um, they often did not have good medical care, so many children died from tuberculosis and other diseases far away from their families. Um, and there was very strict discipline. When students were returned to their tribes years later, the tribes didn't recognize them anymore. They were seen with suspicion. The children who had been full members of that particular in-group no longer spoke the language. They didn't understand the tribal traditions. They had no skills that were necessary for living within that culture. They represented that outside Western culture. And they had been tasked by the people at the Indian schools for driving the assimilation of those who were still in the Indian tribes. And their success was measured by how many Native Americans adopted the ways of the dominant culture. Um, Very few Native Americans ever adopted the ways of the dominant culture because these children came back to their tribes. And many of these children would leave the tribes again later and go back to the boarding schools. On the side of the tribes themselves, they lost an entire generation or two of their potential leaders, and their critical cultural cohesion was destroyed, which led to some of the generational suffering that has happened with Native Americans ever since then.